Hello, everyone. Welcome to this talk at the OII in our new facilities. I'm going to start at the end because otherwise I'll forget. For your awareness, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our website. So if you have any issues with that, please just let us know. Okay, the presentation will be about 30-40 minutes. And then we will have a discussion at the end. With us today, we have an excellent topic, which a certain someone has done their DPhil thesis about at OII.
Actually, two people in this room.
And supervised by excellent supervisors. Anyway, so this is our good friends now from the Reuters, Felix Simon, Richard Fletcher. They will do a double act, I guess, in presenting their topic, which is what does the public think of generative AI in the news? Now, Felix, as I said, is this DPhil on the topic, but he is now a research associate. Well, he's a research associate here, but he's a research fellow at the Reuters Institute, which, if you haven't been, right by University Parks, they have a very nice building. You should really go there. And they have an excellent digital news report, which everyone should make use of. So he's working on this topic there now. And Richard Fletcher is director of research there. And he is the lead author and kind of whole brains behind the operation of the digital news report, which I highly recommend as a source if you're doing anything vaguely on the topic of who uses what sources for news around the world in many, many countries. And I guess they're going to talk about a few of those countries in this talk. So against that background, over to you, Felix and Richard.
Maybe wait with the clapping until the end. But obviously, thank you for being here. And thanks for coming to our talk. Basically, what we will do is we will walk you through some of our research on how audience views and audience behaviors in various countries and also sort of their news consumption are kind of shifting in what we might call the AI age at this point. And we'll sort of anchor this mostly in the Reuters Institute's latest findings and sort of some complementary research on AI news, which is conducted by myself, Richard Fletcher, and our colleague Rasmus Claes-Nielsen, who's now at the University of Copenhagen, but used to be our director until very recently. And for this talk, we'll basically look at how people use generative AI in general, what they think of its use in different sectors, and also what they make of it in the context of news and journalism. I will sort of go through the first half, and then Richard will take on the second half of that research. No, it'd be good if it worked. Nope. Okay, I'll have to manually click. I won't spend too long on the methodology, but in short, what we did was we conducted nationally representative online surveys in 6 countries in 2024 and 2025, the US, UK, Argentina, France, Japan, and Denmark. And the results for this year are from June and July, so fairly recent. And if you're sort of interested in the full methods and sort of breakdowns, you can always find them in the report on our website. But of course, please do ask us questions in the Q&A about it. So just as a general note, survey-based research can have issues with people's recall, and what people say they do might not always sort of match 100% what they actually do, but it's sort of one of the better ways of getting us some information about people's use and views on this topic at scale. And it certainly sort of gives us a more representative overview than we otherwise would have. But let's start with the findings on how the public uses Gen AI in general. And basically, the short answer here is the use is up quite considerably. So we have 61% across countries saying they have ever used Gen AI, which was 34% in the last week, which is up from 40% and 80% respectively in the year before. Almost everyone has now heard of generative AI. These systems really have sort of arrived in the public consciousness. And you can really say that the technology is no longer niche. Most people have heard of at least one AI system, and it's moving into the mainstream. If we look at which tools and systems people say they're using, ChatGPT perhaps unsurprisingly leads. Around 1 in 5 say they use it weekly. Google Gemini and Meta's AI systems are around 1 in 10 weekly users, which is probably sort of makes sense because they are embedded in very large platforms. So you would expect to see more use there. And again, that has doubled from the figures we had for last year. Meanwhile, sort of the tools from smaller dedicated AI companies like Anthropic, so think of Anthropic's Claude, or Perplexity AI, which is sort of very popular with very sort of heavy tech users, actually only see very little use in the public, sort of only around 2% or less on a weekly basis. So they're fairly marginal in use when it comes to the broader population in those countries. But that's quite a different picture if you sort of look at sort of academics, for instance, or people who sort of work in tech and are often sort of heavy users of those systems. ChatGPT, as I just said, is the most widely used AI system overall. A quarter to a third of people say they have tried it, but actually frequent users are still a small subset. So many people have some experience of it, but far fewer people actually rely on it on a daily basis. So if we look, for example, at the UK or in Argentina, the UK have 5% who say they use it on a daily basis. In Argentina, it's actually quite a lot higher, so 16%. One reason there might be sort of different age profiles. If I remember correctly, Argentina has a slightly younger population. So that will sort of affect those results. But I think the important takeaway there is even for the most widely used systems, there's still people who only use this sort of occasionally and not necessarily sort of on a daily basis. Like again, it's something that might be quite different in the circles we sort of move in within this university. Younger users are almost twice as likely as the oldest group to have used any AI tool. Although when we sort of break this down by generative AI system, we actually do see that the age gaps are primarily driven by large differences in the use of ChatGPT, where for the rest it's sort of more evenly distributed. Again, I guess one assumption here could be is that sort of people seek out ChatGPT, or at least in the beginning sort of did do so, and that mostly younger people sort of flock towards that particular system, whereas with the rest, Copilot, Gemini, Meta AI, they're sort of embedded again in broader platforms where the sort of user base will be sort of more evenly distributed by age. But again, that's an assumption. It's not something we could sort of prove with that data. Most tools we do find are more trusted than distrusted. So ChatGPT again tops the trust rankings. DeepSeek and Meta AI systems are more distrusted than trusted, according to our data. It's important to remember that this trust isn't uniform. In many ways, sort of the brand and also transparency, people's perceptions of them, but also where they sort of maybe heard more in terms of media coverage, sort of does drive the way people trust or distrust those systems. And if you think about this in this context, ChatGPT was basically the first to arrive in the scene, at least for the sort of broader public. And with something like DeepSeek, there was a lot of fairly negative coverage actually from national news media around the world, where it was framed very strongly in the context of this AI race between the US and China. So obviously this will have some impact on how people think about those systems and their trust levels in them. A key shift that we've been expecting for a while is that actually information seeking has now overtaken content creation when it comes to the use of those systems. So this year we have 24% of people saying that they use any AI systems for getting information. Last year was just 11%, and creating something, so creating code, creating draft letters, helping with the homework was sort of still higher. That has flipped. So people at this point use AI to get answers, summaries, explanations. And we also do find this is something we only asked for the first time in this year's iteration, is that 7% say that they use AI in some shape or form for regular social interaction. It doesn't necessarily mean that all these 7% see systems like ChatGPT or Claude as a friend, or something that they would sort of treat in the same way as a human person. Those people might be with or will be within that sample. But it does sort of show that people use it for things like getting advice, sort of having something that is maybe not like a close friendship, but sort of somewhere more remote from purely using it as a tool. And it will be quite interesting to see how that sort of pans out in the future. But it's also something that has been found in other sort of survey-based research on this topic, but also sort of within studies from some of the companies themselves. Katya.
Very small clarifying question. So if someone gets help from ChatGPT to write an email to a friend, is that social interaction or creating? How would you categorize it?
It's a good question.
Creating media.
Creating media, yeah. But good point. Meanwhile, and that's of course something of great interest to us as a department or an institute mostly studying sort of news and information consumption, is that sort of getting news via AI system remains still fairly niche. Again, while weekly use for news has doubled from last year, from 3% to 6% on average across those countries, it's still one of the least common information use cases. So growth is real, but we're still in early phases. But again, it's sort of interesting that we see quite strong differences by country. So in the UK, it's basically stalled. But if you look at places like Japan, it's doubled. Argentina has really gone up quite a bit. We also know, again, that this, and we know this from different set of data, the aforementioned digital news report, which has a wider basket of countries in that we look at. We know that this is a lot higher for the under 25-year-olds. So in the last DNR we ran, it was 15% of those, I think, under the age of 25 saying that they sort of use AI systems for news in some shape or form. I think it's sort of an important thing to keep in mind as these things develop. When people do use AI for news, so just looking at the 6% across those countries who did so, or who did say that they did so, the top action is actually getting the latest news. But people also ask things like follow-up questions. They request summaries of news stories, and they use AI to make complex stories easier to understand. This is something we've sort of found in a lot of research, and colleagues have found there's actually a lot of people find it difficult to understand the news. And it seems that among the people who use AI systems for that purpose, that is actually one of the uses to sort of help me understand this or rewrite it in a way that it makes more sense. There's again sort of an age difference. Younger audiences use AI differently here. If we break this group of people using AI systems for news down by age, we find that younger people use these systems more for navigation, explanation across the news cycle, which sort of aligns with a broader trend we see in other research. Younger audiences are more likely to avoid news, partly because they find it hard to understand. And again, AI systems seem to be a way, particularly for that age group, to help with that. One important thing to remember about this is a very small subset. I mean, if you look at the sample sizes, it's really tiny, and it's one area that's not necessarily very well understood. But it's sort of an interesting thing in and of itself, because of course the sort of younger people of today are going to be sort of the main news consumers of tomorrow as well. So the way these people behave already will have an impact on how these things shape the decisions news organizations make, but also the way people are informed in the sort of longer run. So it's important to pay attention to those early signals. Which leads us in many ways to search, where in many ways sort of the features that we see increasingly being rolled out by large digital intermediaries, platform companies, increasingly sort of partially act as a substitute to some of the things news is doing, and that becomes more common. So at this point, I would assume most people in this room and online will have seen an AI summary, at least if they live in the UK, and if they've ever sort of done a search, it's sort of a very common experience for a lot of people. It wasn't actually the case last year, so that's already within the space of years we see a change. And it is something we do see reflected in the data. So over half of the people in the countries we surveyed said that they have seen an AI-generated search response in the last week for one of the queries they had, which makes it actually one of the most common encounters with generative AI. I should also say that the fairly high numbers of people saying no here is partly driven by the results from France, where actually at the time we'd done the survey, we had not yet seen AI overviews being rolled out by Google, which however sort of accounts for roughly, I think, 80+% of the search volume within France. So in that context, it's probably not surprising that lots of French people, and the exact breakdown is in the report, answered no to this, and that sort of drives the average here. And notably, 1 in 5 aren't sure if they have seen them sort of across the countries. Again, that will be partly driven by France, but it also goes to the point that some people might actually realize immediately that they are seeing an AI-generated summary within a search context. But at least when we ask them, and again, like that stated behavior isn't necessarily the same as actual behavior, only about a third say they often always click the source links that these search overviews sometimes provide. Just 8% say they always do so. Younger users are actually slightly more likely to click through, which of course is sort of, again, an interesting thing to bear in mind. But at least when people sort of encounter them, there is some clicking on it, but it sort of goes to at least partly prove some of those arguments that people find that sort of helpful enough and don't necessarily sort of see the need to go further. Roughly half actually say they trust AI search results, which is actually a higher level than for many standalone AI tools. Again, skews a bit higher among younger populations, which again sort of can be explained by the fact that most people are sort of slightly more positive towards technology. And again, sort of the integration into everyday products also seems to raise the sort of baseline trust people have in those AI search results. We also did ask people in open-ended responses what they why they do so, what the sort of self-stated reasons for that trust are. And it's interesting that a lot of them said it's convenience, it's the speed, it's the fact in some cases that AI in their view sort of aggregates vast amounts of information, which people cited as a reason for those systems being trustworthy. It was, however, also interesting to see, and we've seen this also in some of our qualitative work, is that trust is conditional. It's not sort of unconditional. People see this information and say, yep, I will go with this, especially in sort of high stakes domains. So many do say they verify their answers, especially for thornier topics like health or politics, where the stakes are a lot higher. And many also say that they treat AI as a sort of first pass before they check other sources or maybe talk to someone else. So this is sort of one of the areas of research where still we see quite a lot of open questions, and we're aiming to address some of them in future work. But at least these sort of claims that people just sort of encountered this and sort of run away with it, that has to be sort of seen in context. That's not usually how people consume information. Let's briefly widen the lens before I hand over to Richard and look at AI beyond the news. We do actually find that people think that different actors in society use sort of Gen AI quite a lot. So if you look at sort of the top things people say, they think search engine companies use it a lot, social media companies use it a lot in their opinion, but also the news media. Interestingly, oops, oh, it did already appear. Healthcare is sort of fairly at the bottom in terms of people thinking that AI is going to be used or is used a lot in that sector. In many ways, this perception, this is not, it doesn't show actual use, it shows what people think is happening, is important because it shapes their expectations, their worries, the way they sort of think about those sectors and what they mean for their own lives, regardless of the actual practice. There's also the expectation that Gen AI will have a large impact in these very same sectors, although the ranking sort of slightly diverges. So suddenly you see social media on top, searching companies one below. The news media has sort of moved slightly down the ranking, but it sort of again goes to show that people have sort of interesting view on what it will do. But the picture suddenly looks very different when we ask which sectors people trust to use generative AI responsibly, where scientists and healthcare professionals, maybe in good news for us in this room, actually remain at the top here in terms of very high trust of using those systems in a responsible and good way. But the news media, governments, and social media companies, and politics and political parties actually see this as the least trustworthy in terms of how they will use these. And again, as for reasons why that is the case, there's some obvious assumptions we could probe and probably do so in future work. But a lot of this is sort of driven by people's existing attitudes to those sectors and the knowledge about those sectors. So lots of people actually in cross-country surveys have a lot of trust in healthcare professionals and scientists, even though that has come under attack recently. So of course you would expect that to sort of drive to some degree how people trust these very same institutions or groups to use AI in a good way. Now, we can also think about people's expectations about what generative AI means for the future performance of those sectors, especially in relation to them. And again, across societies, people tend to think AI will make most sectors and their own interaction with them better rather than worse, which is sort of an interesting thing to keep in mind when you hear quite the opposite from a lot of pundits and sort of journalists who are writing about this, where usually it's sort of the opposite view. and everything's sort of going to shit. It's going to be the enshittification argument in some ways. It's not necessarily the way people think about this. But again, there are exceptions. So for news, but also government and politics, kind of aspects we just heard about, people are more pessimistic. And again, things like when we look at the news, for instance, media skepticism, low institutional trust will sort of weigh on people's perceptions in these contexts. Looking sort of more specifically on the news media's use of AI, people actually think AI is widely used in news, but they also think it will make news worse, which is sort of tied in many countries to like trust in news, also some cynicism about the media's incentives and behavior. And it's quite interesting to compare that, for example, with how people rank search engines in this context, where they think AI is actually used quite a lot, but they also think it makes the experience much or somewhat better. And that's sort of, if you go back to the slide where we heard about people's trust in those systems, this is sort of something that people encounter on a daily basis, and where the view in general seems to be that it's actually a useful development, sort of all things considered. And with that, I will hand over to my colleague Richard.
Questions on your report, is it possible? Let's take them afterwards because we're running a bit late.
Okay, I'll speed up then. Because with the Reuters Institute, we've also focused specifically on what people think about AI being used in the newsroom. We know that from our other research that many newsrooms are incorporating AI into their practices, and this is starting to filter down to kind of the public imagination, and people are starting to form their views on this. It's worth saying that, of course, many people don't really have a sort of strong view on this issue, and we give them space in the survey to kind of indicate a neutral answer or don't know. But we are going to focus on some of the findings. So we can start with labeling, which is a question that we asked about, and this, of course, is a key issue. So whether news organizations should label content if it's been made with AI. And what we see here is that almost everyone in the survey selected one of these different examples for labeling, but there's no real consensus on what should be labeled. But if we're kind of trying to see patterns, we can see that near the top of the list, we have these kind of more ambitious uses of AI, if I can put it that way. So creating images, people are more likely to think that is something that should be labeled, writing text of an article. And then right at the bottom, we've got editing, spelling and grammar, which people are less likely to think should be labeled. And in terms of how often people see labeled AI content, actually it's not something that is, confined to a tiny proportion of the population. So around 20% on average say that they see labeled AI news content on a daily basis. Now, this is much smaller, of course, than the 77% who see any kind of news on a daily basis, but nonetheless, this is something that people are reporting they're seeing. This is sort of course, there are other ways in which AI is being utilized by news organizations in order to kind of better serve their audiences. These are just two examples, one from the FT and one from The Economist. So Ask FT is essentially a kind of, it's not a chatbot exactly, it's more like a RAG, but the idea is you ask questions and answers are given based on the FT's sort of corpus. And then The Economist, summarization using AI, which I think many other news organizations are trying as well. So we're interested in whether people say they've seen news organizations doing any of these. And actually, what we see is that relatively few report seeing these features. We're not asking about use, we're asking about whether people just see them. And summaries are the most commonly encountered. But when it comes to things like format conversion, so using AI to automatically convert text into audio or something like this is not something that people are really seeing as yet. And sort of kind of one of the recurring themes in the report is the idea that younger people are more positive and more interested in the use of AI, and this applies to news as well. And we can see that amongst younger audiences, there's slightly more interest in some of these AI-powered features. But I think it's worth noting that interest overall is pretty low. I think this is part of a theme where consumer demand for AI-powered features around news and it isn't that strong. And we can see that, I guess, in some of the skepticism around the use of AI earlier on in the survey. We also asked about people's kind of general comfort with AI being used to make news in the newsroom, and we obviously wanted to compare that to levels of comfort with kind of different different levels of sort of AI integration, if I can put it that way. So if we look at the left of the chart, only 12% say that they're comfortable with news being entirely made by AI. 21% say they're comfortable with it mostly by AI, but with some human oversight. But we can see much higher figures for news that is made either mostly by a human or entirely by a human journalist. Now, we asked this question in 2024 as well, and what you can see is that opinion hasn't changed very much. That's true across a lot of the data points about the use of AI in the newsroom, but opinion has hardened slightly. So you can see slightly more positive views about human-made journalism and slightly more kind of negative views, if you like, of news made by AI. And that's something that we see on a number of data points. There is country variation here. So I've sort of plotted the gap between, and we call it the comfort gap between news made by predominantly by humans in the green, and then news made by AI in the blue. And you can see that in the UK, the gap is particularly large, and that's true also in other European countries. In Japan and Argentina, which in lots of ways people are much more positive about the use of AI in the newsroom, we see that gap is smaller, but it still exists. We also asked about the specific tasks that people, or the level of comfort people have in specific journalistic tasks being performed by AI. And again, there's always a distinction between these kind of more back-end tasks rather than sort of audience-facing sort of content. So people are much more comfortable, for example, with the idea that journalists use AI to edit spelling and grammar of an article. Far less comfortable, if we look at the bottom of the chart, with, for example, creating an artificial presenter or author, which may sound a bit like sci-fi, but in some newsrooms in some countries across the world, this is something that is happening. And these three at the bottom I've marked in red just because the proportion who say they're uncomfortable with AI being used in this way is larger than the proportion who say they're comfortable. The opposite is true for those marked in the green. And as you can see from in the last year or so, we haven't really seen much change in this opinion. Where we did see a change, though, is on that same list of tasks, how often people think that journalists are actually using AI to do them. And actually, we've seen quite sort of, kind of marked growth for some of these, so up by nearly 10 percentage points in some cases. Not true for all things, but pretty much every task has seen some kind of growth. So even when it comes to creating an artificial presenter and author, the 3 percentage point increase from 2024. And actually, these data points kind of align. So what this chart is showing is that the tasks that people are more comfortable with AI being used for are actually the ones that they think journalists are doing most often. So in this sense, it's a kind of positive story about sort of public opinion on AI in the newsroom, given that even though people are cautious, the tasks that are being they think are being sort of performed the most, they're the most comfortable with. Slightly less positive, though, is the data on checking. So this, we asked here how often people think that journalists check the outputs from generative AI. And you can see that actually only around a third think that journalists always or often check AI outputs. Excuse me. Again, I think this is partly linked to kind of general skepticism or cynicism around the news media and around journalistic practices. But nonetheless, I think it just highlights the importance of communicating how AI is being used in the newsroom. And we didn't see much change in this either. A slight increase, very small increase in the proportion of people who say that they think outputs are checked always and often, but still a cause for concern for journalists, I think. Again, this really does depend on trust, though. So unsurprisingly, those who have more trust in the news media are considerably more likely to think that checking takes place. But even amongst those who have very high levels of trust in the news media, it's still not the case that they think that journalists are kind of always and often sort of checking outputs. There's still some skepticism there, even amongst those who have high levels of trust. There is quite a big difference, I think, in how people think different outlets will behave when it comes to AI. So in the green bars, we can see that larger proportions of people think there'll be somewhat larger or very large differences between how different outlets use AI in the newsroom, and particularly so in a country like the UK, where there's people draw quite broad distinctions between different outlets. So I think this is also useful for journalists to sort of keep in mind as they're using AI, is that they can make a case, I think, for using AI, and if they communicate that to the public, then there's the possibility that there'll be some acceptance. But what this kind of means overall, when we ask about whether people think AI will make journalism more or less of each of these different attributes, we see a really sort of sharp distinction. So overall, people think that AI will make news and journalism cheaper to make, and to a certain extent more up to date. But they also think it will make it less transparent and less trustworthy overall. And again, if we look at the difference between 2024 and 2025, again, we can see a kind of hardening of opinion. So not huge changes, but that sort of distinction between the different sort of positive and negative outcomes of the use of AI in journalism has grown a little larger in the space of 1 year. I'm just going to finish with something else that we did in the survey, which we haven't published yet, but we're still working on. This is a pre-registered experiment on how AI can be used in the newsroom. And it relates to interest in news. Now, I haven't got this on a slide, but it's worth pointing out that interest levels in news have really tumbled in a lot of countries in the last 10 years. So in the UK, the proportion of people who are highly interested in news has pretty much halved from around 70% in 2015 to 35% or so in 2025. And that's true also across Germany, across France, across Spain, across many other countries in Europe and around the world. So we're interested in whether AI can be used to address this in some way. Now, there's a couple of notes here on sort of interest in news and previous research, which I won't go into. I think the key point is that it's really difficult to change people's levels of interest in news. Also we've been told there are very steep declines. Some of this is to do with kind of demographic replacement, but nonetheless, you know, this is a problem that needs addressing. And I think there's a potential for AI to kind of step in here. So can AI be used to create content or adapt content that's already been produced that better suits the needs of those with low interest in the news, or perhaps high levels of news avoidance? Is there something that can be done here? So what we set out to find, we designed an experiment to see whether AI can make news articles easier to read and more interesting. And this is all very preliminary, and I'm sorry about the horrible sort of variable names, but this is just to sort of kind of point out that the sort of kind of initial results that we looked at, we took an article on tariffs, put it through sort of quite a long prompt in each of these different countries, so 6 different countries, 5 different languages. And we actually found that participants, when they looked at the AI adapted version of the article, did report finding it easier to read and also more interesting, which is kind of what we were hoping for. There's some interesting marginal effects around different interest levels, which I won't go into because we're still working on the analysis. But this again I think is just something that journalists and newsrooms are thinking through, and this is something that we thought was worth testing. And of course, if you use ChatGPT to churn out an article like this isn't necessarily how it would be used in the newsroom. Something more fine-tuned would be used, I think. But this is a kind of proof of concept more than anything else on how AI can be used to help with some of these kind of long-standing and difficult issues that we've documented in some of our other research. So just to recap quickly before we go into the Q&A, what we've seen in this report is that public use of AI is rising fast. ChatGPT is leading, but it's actually AI in search results where people are most likely to encounter AI at the moment. And information seeking is really emerging as a key use. Across sectors, AI is seen as beneficial overall, but many people think it will make news specifically worse. And then finally, in journalism, we haven't seen as much sort of change in opinion on how AI will affect journalism in the space of 1 year, in contrast to the data we saw on use. But we're starting to see that acceptance or comfort is task dependent. People are okay with it being used for kind of back-end tasks, but are much more wary around AI content. And there's uncertainties about verification and responsible AI use. But there's still, I think, and this speaks to the experiment, some hope that I think that AI can be used to repair some of the fraying connections with the public that journalism is experiencing at the moment. So with that, if people are interested in our other research on the AI and the Future of News projects, please go ahead and use the QR code. We've got our email addresses here, and happy to go into the Q&A. Thanks very much.
Next. They call that a tour de force. We also had a session earlier on about student use of AI, not moving forward. And that's parallels here. You were first.
Hello, can you switch to the slide about trust in different language models, like DeepSeek and versus other ones?
Yeah, maybe there's a quick way of doing that while
Yeah.
we're going through.
Well, till you go there, I'm gonna start the question.
Sure.
So I think there is a cool trinity here between the affiliation of the models. Like we have ChatGPT, which is known as a liberal one, and then Grok, which is known as let's say more Republican ones, and then we have DeepSeek, which is none of these, but it's by like owned by a foreign government that is seen as adversary by the media. So I was wondering.
Is it that one you mean?
Yep. So your data is aggregated, right? So, but you still have like Argentina, which is the only country from global south, and then you have Denmark, which is a very liberal country, and then you have US itself. So I'm wondering, the question is basically if you have a cross-tabular analysis of these things as
From
well.
memory, I think that's in the report, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just to be clear on this chart, what this is showing is the difference between trust and distrust. So for those marked in the red, the percentages for distrust were slightly higher than the percentages for trust, and vice versa with the green. So yes,
Yeah.
I think one of the things about trust as well is that as we saw it in the earlier part of the presentation, the use of many of these tools is low. So people are not necessarily basing their trust on their experience of using those tools, which means that it's going to be shaped to some extent by all sorts of other factors. And I think Felix mentioned the kind of news coverage around DeepSeek. There's also, kind of in some cases, if a tool is associated with a tech company, people's views of that tech company will come to shape. And I think you're right that probably will play out in differently in different countries. So this is the aggregate picture. But from memory, I don't think we saw huge kind of inversion of the patterns. I think what we typically saw was that in a country like Argentina and Japan, which, as I mentioned, are more positive about AI in general, you sort of higher trust levels across the board. And then in a country like the UK, the kind of trust levels are more sort of negative across the board. So we didn't see a kind of flipping around of this picture.
Yep.
But I'm pretty sure the chart is in the report if you're interested.
Hey, thanks, Sus, for the very interesting presentation. I have a sort of maybe more methodological question. I was curious how you ended up with the selection of these particular LLMs. And also, as a follow-up, were there country differences? It's quite interesting. Or are they kind of the dominant ones are always the same across these sort of 6 quite different countries?
Yeah, well, there's a chart on that, I think. Oh, no, it's an aggregate one, isn't it? So, yeah. But perhaps you can say about how we chose them.
Oh, right. Yeah, I think we have to go back to the very beginning, actually. It's basically we did lots of desk research and try to identify the ones that are sort of most common in general and people will have heard about, and then strategically picking some where we knew that they are sort of very heavily being used and come from sort of well-backed companies. But ultimately, it was sort of a judgment call, and it's not something. I think we asked about 12 or 14 in total.
Yeah.
But of course, if we could have, we would have asked for a lot more. But the problem there, of course, within the survey is you can't sort of, I think this one is sort of a good example.
Yeah.
So you basically you cannot sort of ask people to sort of rank or give opinions on 100 different ones. I mean, you can in theory, but it's just very time consuming. So basically, we sort of try to find the most common ones, the largest ones, but including some strategic ones.
Yeah, we made a few switches from 2024 to 2025, primarily due to the fact that
DeepSeek didn't exist.
well, yeah, but in 2024 we asked about some that really got no sort of traction at all, so we swapped those out for 2025, and again the country differences are pretty small. So even in France, you might expect sort of Mistral to be sort of used much more, but we didn't see that. There was a slight difference in France compared to the other countries, but nothing sort of transformative.
Okay, thanks.
Hello. Thank you so much. I had, I guess, more of like a broad scope question. I'm wondering, with your research about using AI to reach people who might have like a declining or low interest in news, how we can balance using AI in that way without harming the news ecosystem. There was some research from NPR that came out last year, I believe, that was basically saying that the introduction of Google AI Overview, for example, has led to like dramatic declines in clicks for news outlets and other information sources. And obviously, like, news deserts are a very real problem and like the declining business model for journalism. So I'm wondering if you guys had any opinions on how to balance like using AI to reach people who wouldn't normally click on news articles while also like not harming.
Yeah, I mean, my sort of own opinion on this is that there are lots of ways that AI can be used, which doesn't sort of undermine the work of journalists. So this is kind of one of the reasons why we chose this as the experiment, is that it starts with an article written by a journalist and asks how can we maximize the use of this article or the impact of this article, rather than saying, oh well, we can use AI to sort of kind of do the work of journalists. It's taking what journalists have already made and making the most of it. And I think there are a number of other ways in which the AI can do that. It may not be the ways that, or the things that news organizations are most interested in at the moment, but I think there's plenty of options. So, for example, using AI to make news more accessible for people with visual impairment, for example, and so things like this, I think, are really positive uses of AI. And I think it's sort of slightly separate from what's happening in the kind of broader ecosystem, or what might happen in the future, which is sort of kind of an extension of the kind of long running kind of tensions between sort of platforms and news organizations. This feels like the sort of kind of the next stage of that. But I think from my point of view, it's too early to really tell what's happening, for example, with search, AI overviews and news use, in part because the AI sort of overviews feature is sort of not enabled for news related queries at the moment. So I think it's still quite early, and we'll have to see how that unfolds.
Hi, thanks so much for the presentation. I had a question on the two slides, but I think they're related. It's the one about clicking through news sources. If you could go to that one real quick, I think. Yeah, this one. So I'm curious also, and I think the question will also be related to the comfort gap slide you mentioned. But I'm curious if you have any intuition, so like crosstabs between countries, and I'm curious if there's any intuition or like thoughts on how different regulatory environments might be contributing. Like for example, I think I'm not 100% sure, but I think certain, like maybe in Denmark or European countries, there's stronger regulation about saying this was generated by AI, here's the sources kind of thing, or it has to be more like in your face sort of thing. And then a kind of related question is how social norms differing by country. So I'm also thinking of the Scandinavian countries tend to have pretty high trust in their news sources and In the US, for example, we don't. So I'm wondering how that might play into the kind of results you see in the comfort gap. So like regulatory environment and social norms influencing these.
I mean, certainly underlying trust, we think that's a big sort of factor. And there was a couple of slides, I think, which sort of pointed to that. And I don't think it's a coincidence that, for example, in sort of relatively high trust countries, you see kind of different attitudes towards how the news media will use AI. But it's, it's also difficult to separate that from the fact that in certain countries, there may be more kind of coordinated initiatives from the news media around transparency. There may also be differences, as you say, in the regulatory environment, which I think is sort of shifting and still sort of taking shape. And I think we would need a few more kind of data points, by over time to sort of really sort of see the effect of that. But I think I wouldn't be surprised if because a lot of the sort of country differences are pretty small at the moment. I mentioned sort of Argentina and Japan being a bit more positive, but overall they're not as large as one might expect. But it's possible that they'll start to diverge over time as changes to the regulatory environment become more salient.
I think just briefly on the regulatory environment, that might have an effect going forward. I would personally think it might not yet sort of materially impact the results we've seen here, because I think the one you're referring to, especially for the EU, would be the AI Act, which has sort of transparency requirements. I'm not like policy expert, but I think that's sort of one thing, but that hasn't been. It's not yet sort of fully enforced. And if you sort of consider, for instance, that when we think about AI summaries, we're basically talking about Google, because in all those countries, Google is sort of the dominant search engines by quite a large margin. And as far as I know, Google AI only sort of look very similar in all those countries, in the way they sort of display links and further sources. But you're right. I mean, this could change once the AI Act starts to bite in different EU countries, where potentially Google and other competitors are forced or encouraged to sort of make changes, which then will maybe sort of filter through and the way people sort of say they click or don't click.
Other questions or comments? I have a couple. Otherwise, no one in the room. Excellent. And I get to ask mine. I have two. So one thing you mentioned is that people use it, I think, most for getting the latest news. And is that consistent with the fact that AI models don't always give you the latest things? I mean, or am I missing something?
Certainly, they didn't used to, but I think more recent iterations of the most kind of widely used models can do a version of this. So we did a study in 2024 where we asked ChatGPT, but also Gemini, to give us the latest news headlines from specific outlets, and then we kind of coded up the results to see how closely it matched what was on the homepage at the time. And this is a sort of slightly sort of unfair task in a way, because I'm not sure that's how people really sort of use AI. They probably don't say, give me from a specific outlet, but we wanted to be able to sort of have a kind of ground truth to sort of compare it to. And when we did that, we found that in most cases, the chatbot kind of refused to do it, or said, I can't do that. But in other cases, it sort of did try to do this, and when it did, it sort of got. In some cases, you got a pretty good picture of what was on the homepage. In other cases, the stories were slightly sort of out of date, and of course, some news sites block AI crawlers, so that's where it didn't work at all. So it's not that it can't work in principle, because we sort of showed that, I think around 10% of the time it did a pretty good job, but nonetheless, for whatever reason, it wasn't a particularly sort of reliable use of AI. And I think, if we were to repeat this now, we might see slightly different results. But I don't think it's like a sort of fundamental technical limitation that is stopping this.
Before I get to Gemma, let me ask my second one, which is related to the experiment. I mean, I think you could interpret easy and more interesting as actually being completely opposite things. So easy is you're just being served, and more interesting could be I want to interact more with it. Is that a kind of dichotomy you see, or is that something that one might build into future experiments? Because, you know, that could actually be, so to speak, the clincher as to the difference between the two.
I mean, I can start, and then maybe if you want to.
Yeah, go for it. An obvious answer.
We didn't think of it as a dichotomy. We saw them as just two kind of distinct outcomes, I guess. But it might be interesting to look at, and this isn't something that we pre-registered, but as an additional question, we might be able to look at, well, you know, are there those other people who found it sort of, you know, kind of more interesting, or sorry, easier to understand but less interesting, for example, and that might come out also in when we look at differences by interest. But it's a good thought.
Firstly, just a brilliant presentation. It was absolutely fascinating to listen to. I just had a question more for like maybe future or something to think about. Just because at the moment it's just like news but undifferentiated. I wondered whether there would be maybe more of an impact or a sense of comfort, whether it was like local news versus regional news versus global news, based on a sense of maybe like local protectionism versus like your own news industry, or even I don't feel maybe as comfortable with Gen AI talking about like local Oxford news, but I would feel more comfortable with like a Gen AI explanation of something in Mongolia, which is very far outside of like what I might be familiar with. So I was just, rather than like news, maybe more like subdivision by like closeness versus distance might be an interesting intersection point.
Okay, I'm glad this is being recorded, because we will start designing another round of this survey from early next year. So this might actually be something we could look at, because I think you could be right that at least when we talk about this subset of people using it for news purposes, that might differ depending on the sort of level we talk about, as you say, local versus say international news, which also would probably correlate with some of the findings. I think Luke is sort of working on this in some ways, that for local news, especially in countries which are non-English speaking, quite often the representation within AI systems is just a lot worse compared to international news, where they have scraped a lot more, but also where there's data agreements in place between sort of different big AI companies and systems providers and various news organizations. So I think it would be very interesting. I think that the one thing I would say to this, again, with all of this to keep in mind, is it's still like it's growing, but I think there's quite a big share of other use cases which are not news related directly. So in many ways we find this interesting, sort of the entire news stuff, but I think we also shouldn't forget that actually just as most people, when we sort of look at the media consumption, actually don't necessarily sort of consume a lot of news. They sort of consume other stuff. They go on Netflix, they go on YouTube. They want things that entertain, inspire them. They want to learn. And news is sort of a part, sort of a very tiny sliver of that. I think we currently see that play out with AI systems too. But at least within the news context, I think this would be a very interesting question to address.
In the digital newsroom, we did look at differences by topic. So how comfortable are you with AI being used in the newsroom for a range of different topics? And it's perhaps unsurprising, but if you know, people are more comfortable with AI being used on kind of lighter topics, if I can put it that way, in part because I think the consequences of mistakes are sort of less meaningful. And then for things like politics, international news, then there's much more kind of caution. But yeah, that's obviously not quite the same as the thing that you were asking about.
I had a question that actually builds on Gemma's and also relates a bit to your answer right now. So I've noticed these two things. When you talk about trust in the news, at some point you were mentioning that sometimes it's about convenience and speed, right? That people are using it for, I don't know, was it information seeking more generally, or perhaps specifically in the news? It's not even, I think, there's the most trustworthy source, but it's like speedy and convenient is good enough. And then there is this dimension of high stakes and low stakes. And I was wondering if you've like looked at any interactions with it, that people are willing, if I'm looking for health, sort of, I have a health concern, I will be more investing in it and I will interpret it. I don't know, convenience will not be my priority, like trustworthiness will really trump convenience in that case. But if it's something that's not terribly relevant for me, it's not my local news even perhaps, but something somewhere where I don't particularly care about, but slightly interested. I don't know, was there any?
I don't think we haven't done this with the survey data, but in some qualitative research led by my colleague Amy Rosa-Guedes, where we've had sort of focus groups or basically interviews and then sort of also tasks where we sort of gave people different Gen AI things to play around with. which we did across UK, Mexico, and the US.
Yeah.
I think that sort of came out in some of those interviews that there's sort of difference depending on the topic. So I think you're onto something. It's not something we've done for the survey data so far.
Yeah, I think what you described sounds very plausible to me, but I also think it's worth keeping in mind that I think of a lot of the uses of AI that people are kind of kind of using on a daily basis, trust probably isn't hugely important. I mean, and it's not every even if it's information retrieval, like trust isn't necessarily as important as it is in some cases if people are kind of using it to sort of pass the time or get kind of book recommendations. Okay, you want good recommendations, but trust is not the same as if it would be with like you say with a health related query.
I think a final question over here.
I think there's a question
sorry.
back actually.
Sorry.
Yeah. To take somebody who hasn't asked.
Yeah, sorry. I have.
Why don't you ask yours first? Yeah, then we'll take two. Go ahead. We'll take two anyway.
Thanks for the presentation. I think it's very fascinating to hear. Sorry I came a bit late, but I just want to ask a question about the country selection. You chose Japan as one of the country for your survey, but like I was like also see that you use DeepSeek as also MTIG survey as well. I'm just wondering because we have like some insights about like Chinese people like using, for example, or social media. They don't have the need to use non-Chinese platforms to for their kind of news for needs for like information, entertainment, or etc. So, because I didn't see kind of China being included as a news, and I think also it's probably hard as well. But I was just want to ask for your like opinion on the country selection and also like whether it's gonna be affect the results with the DeepSeek results that you have. For example, on untrusted distress.
Sorry, can you go to the slide on the experiment results just quickly? With the chart. It's okay if you can't find it. I can just ask. I just wanted to ask if because you have these outcome measures of like readability, yeah, and more interesting. But I wondered if you had some type of measure, like I think that also tracks really well with my intuition that AI makes things, easier to read, shorter, etc. But I wondered if you had any, like, if you were going to include some type of measure of like accuracy or believability of the AI generated article.
No, we didn't have that in the survey. We obviously checked the outputs to make sure that it was kind of resembled the article. But I mean, one interesting potential outcome would be something like kind of knowledge gained from reading the article, and I think that would be useful. We did also have engagement, which is just how long people spent reading the article. That obviously matters to news organizations and is related to some of these. But of course, it's related in kind of odd ways, because if something is easier to read, that sort of implies that they would spend less time with it, even though they might they might have read the whole thing. So we've got that, and we're still trying to sort of understand what that sort of data is telling, but it's not a sort of straightforward picture. But yeah, no, you're right. I mean, there's tons more sort of interesting kind of outcomes that we probably will look at the next time we do it.
Briefly on the China question.
On the country selection, yeah. So I mean, the country selection it's always hard because we always try and do comparative research, and it costs money, and we have a certain budget. So we knew we want to
go to the bucket later.
We picked 6 countries, and essentially what we were aiming for was kind of geographic spread. So
but you don't have Hong Kong either.
No, I mean, no, it's yeah, no.
But so even in the DNR, you don't have Hong Kong.
No, we do.
We do.
We do.
Well, that would be interesting for DeepSeek, because you don't do China in the DNR, but you do Hong Kong.
Yeah,
that might be interesting.
We don't have. I don't think we have data on the sort of specific tools that people are using from the DNR. But just on country selection, it was essentially motivated primarily by geographic spread, and other sort of more practical considerations, like whether there was a sort of a sufficient level of kind of AI awareness and things like this.
There's also media systems in our context, like they all fall sort of in slightly different media systems category. I know it was a concept it's been heavily debated, but it's still fairly widely used in communications research because it is a useful sort of distinguisher. So especially for the news related questions, it was important to us to have a sort of mix in there of countries falling into different basically the sort of three main categories of media systems.
And I should say as well, in most cases where there are interesting country differences, that data is in the report. It's just not in this presentation.
We've learned an awful lot. Thank you so much.